There is a sound that has followed the M1 Garand for 80 years. A metallic ping, high and clear, the empty clip ejecting after the 8th round. You have heard it in Saving Private Ryan. You have heard it in the Pacific. You have heard it in every barroom argument about whether that sound got American soldiers killed. It did not, but a different sound, one that nobody remembers, almost killed the rifle before it ever reached the battlefield. The sound of a screw-on gas cylinder rattling loose after sustained fire. The sound of carbon fouling so hardened inside a muzzle cap that armorers needed a chisel to clean it. The sound of a bayonet wobbling on a collar that was supposed to hold it rigid. 48,119 rifles made that sound. Everyone was recalled before Pearl Harbor. On the night of October 25th, 1942, the weapon that replaced them fired so fast on Guadalcanal that Japanese officers believed they were facing machine guns across the entire American line. There are two mistakes in this story. The one everyone remembers did not matter. The one nobody talks about changed the war. Jean Cantius Garand was born on the 1st of January, 1888, on a small farm near Saint-Remy, Quebec. He was one of 12 children, 6 boys, 6 girls. His father worked the land in a part of Canada where the winters lasted longer than the growing season and the soil gave back less than what was put into it. When his mother died in 1899, the family came apart the way farm families did when the center was removed. His father gathered the children and moved them south across the border to Jewett City, Connecticut, not for opportunity, for survival. The children went to work. John was 11 years old. He swept floors in a textile mill. The machines around him were louder than anything he had heard on the farm. Rows of looms clattering in a rhythm that shook the wooden floor under his feet. He learned English there, not in a classroom. On the factory floor, listening to the men who ran the machines, repeating what they said until the words felt natural in his mouth. He attended one more year of school after that. Then he stopped. The man who would design the rifle that armed the American infantry across 2 wars and 3 continents finished his formal education at the age of 12. What he had, instead of a diploma, was an obsession with 2 things: machines and shooting. A gun club near the family house in Jewett City left target rifles at the Garand home between matches. Nobody asked the boy to shoot. Nobody taught him. He taught himself the same way he had taught himself English. By watching, by repeating, by refusing to stop until the thing worked. In 1909, at the age of 21, he apprenticed as a machinist at Brown & Sharp in Providence, Rhode Island. Brown & Sharp was not a gun company. It was a precision tool manufacturer, one of the best in America, and the skills Garand learned there, the ability to hold tolerances, measured in thousandths of an inch, would define everything that followed. At night he took correspondence courses in engineering. He had no degree, no credentials, no connections. What he had was an understanding of metal under stress that most university-trained engineers did not develop until years into their careers. In 1917, the United States entered the First World War. The War Department put out bids for a light machine gun design. Garand, working on his own, submitted plans. The War Department bought them. A man without a high school education had produced a design the American military was willing to pay for. On November 4th, 1919, John Garand reported for work as a consulting engineer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. He was 31 years old. He would walk through those gates every working day for the next 34 years. His assignment was written in the deliberately plain language the Ordnance Department preferred. Design a self-loading infantry rifle to replace the bolt-action Springfield Model 1903. The sentence was simple. The task behind it was not. Nobody had ever built a successful semi-automatic rifle for a major army. The British had tried. The French had tried. The Germans were trying. The 36 cartridge, the standard American round, generated enormous chamber pressure, and that pressure kept defeating every prototype. The gas that made the bullet lethal also made the mechanism uncontrollable. Every designer who tried to harness it watched his prototype shake itself apart. 15 years of work followed. Trial, failure, redesign, trial again. Most of it was invisible to the public. Almost none of it made the newspapers. Garand worked on a civil service salary that never made him wealthy and never seemed to bother him. He patented the basic operating action in 1934. On January 9th, 1936, the United States Army standardized his design as the U.S. rifle, caliber 30 M1. It was the first standard-issue semi-automatic infantry rifle in the history of warfare. No other country on earth had managed it. Not the British Empire, not the German Reich, not the Soviet Union. A boy who had quit school at 12 and swept floors in a Connecticut textile mill had solved the problem that defeated them all. Mass production began at Springfield Armory in September of 1937. The pace was not encouraging. 10 rifles per day, 945 in all of 1937. Europe was sliding toward war. France was rearming. Germany was absorbing Austria, and the new American service rifle was crawling into existence at a speed that would have alarmed anyone paying attention. And then something began to go wrong. Garand's original design used a system that armorers and collectors would later call the gas trap. The name was informal. It never appeared in official ordnance documentation, but the principle was straightforward. After the bullet left the barrel, expanding propellant gas was caught in the space between the muzzle and a screw-on metal cap. The trapped gas was redirected backward through a cylinder, where it pushed a piston that drove the operating rod, which cycled the action and loaded the next round. On paper, it was elegant. In controlled testing, it worked. But once the rifles left Springfield Armory and began to see real use in the hands of real soldiers, a list of problems started appearing in reports from the field. The screw holding the gas cylinder plug in place could loosen under sustained fire. When it loosened, the cylinder shifted out of alignment. A misaligned cylinder placed a metal lip directly in the path of a bullet, leaving the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second. On a small number of early production rifles, the projectile struck that lip and blew the entire gas cylinder off the end of the barrel. Carbon fouling built up inside the gas trap mechanism faster and thicker than in any comparable system. Standard cleaning equipment could not remove it. Veteran armors at Springfield said later that getting hardened carbon out of an early gas trap sometimes required a chisel. The bayonet mount, attached to that same screw-on cylinder, was not rigid enough for infantry use. A man fixing bayonets for a charge needed his blade locked tight to the weapon. What he got instead was a wobble on a threaded collar. None of these problems were catastrophic on their own. Most gas trap rifles fired thousands of rounds without blowing apart. But these were the kind of flaws that compound over time. In mud, in heat, in dust, under the kind of sustained neglect that combat imposes on equipment, a small flaw becomes a failure. A failure becomes a dead soldier. By 1000, 1939, men in the field were noticing. So were the ordnance officers in Washington. This is the moment in the story where most armies in history have made a specific choice. The choice is denial. Nobody wants to admit that the new weapon, the one the budget was fought for, the one Congress was told would modernize the infantry, the one already rolling off the production line and into the hands of soldiers drilling on parade grounds, is not quite what was promised. In 1939, with German tanks rolling through Poland, the political math pointed in one direction. Keep building what you have. Ship it. Hope the flaw does not matter in combat. Germans knew their G14 semi-automatic rifle had reliability problems. They kept building it. The Soviets knew their SVT-38 had its own list of failures. They kept building it. When a major war is coming, you do not stop the assembly line. You ship what you have and pray. The United States Army did something else. On March 8, 1939, Major Guy H. Drury sat down at his desk in the office of the Chief of Ordnance in Washington, D.C., and typed a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Marsh at Fort Benning, Georgia. The letter still exists. It is preserved in the Springfield Armory archives. Almost nobody outside the small community of M. Garand collects and historians has ever heard of it, and it is one of the more remarkable documents in the institutional history of the American military. Drury wrote about something he and John Garand had been quietly working on for months. A redesigned front end. The gas trap was out. In its place, Garand had developed a simpler, stronger arrangement. A port drilled directly into the barrel near the muzzle, through which propellant gas would be channeled into a smaller cylinder to drive the operating rod. No screw-on cap, no false muzzle, no misalignment risk. The new system was easier to clean, stronger under sustained fire, and it locked the bayonet directly to the barrel itself. Drury reported that the new front end had been put through a 10,000-round endurance test. The functioning, he wrote, was very good. On June 10, 1939, Drury wrote again, this time to Captain H. G. Sydenham at Fort Benning. 10 test rifles with the new front end would soon be shipped down for evaluation. By October 4th, those rifles were on their way. And on October 26, 1939, 53 days after Adolf Hitler invaded Poland, the United States Army Ordnance Committee formally recommended that the gas trap system be replaced with the new gas port design. Think about what that recommendation actually was. Think about what the men who signed it were putting on paper. The United States Army had a service rifle. The institution had spent more than a decade and a significant portion of its peacetime weapons budget developing it. Springfield Armory was producing it. The Infantry Board had approved it. Soldiers in the 116th Infantry Regiment were drilling with it on parade grounds. The Philippines garrison was being issued it. And now, in October of 1939, the Ordnance Department put in writing, with signatures, that the version in production was the wrong version. The Army stopped the assembly line. Gas trap production continued at a slow pace through the spring and summer of 1940, while Springfield Armory retooled. The final engineering drawings for the new gas port front end were completed on March 15, 1940, 21 months before Pearl Harbor. Delivery of the redesigned components began in June. The last gas trap M1 Garand rolled off the Springfield line in August of 1940. The final count, recorded by historian Bruce Canfield and consistent with Springfield Armory archival records, was 48,000. 119 gas trap rifles built. Almost everyone was recalled. The flawed front ends were stripped off and replaced with the new design at depot-level facilities across the country. Once the redesign was locked in, production climbed in a way that should have alarmed anyone watching the United States from Berlin or from Tokyo. By January 10th, 1941, still almost a full year before Pearl Harbor, Springfield Armory was finishing 600 rifles per day. Winchester Repeating Arms opened a parallel production line in New Haven, Connecticut. At peak wartime output in January of 1944, Springfield alone rolled out 122,000 rifles in 31 days, roughly 4,000 per day, 164 per hour, around the clock. Women working in the Women Ordnance Workers Program made up 43% of the Springfield workforce at peak production. Between the two factories, more than 4 million M1 Garands were built before the war ended. Every single one had the redesigned front end. This is the link in the causal chain that almost no documentary about the M1 Garand has ever bothered to explain. The gas trap did not make the rifle feared. The gas trap was a piece of metal almost nobody outside Springfield Armory ever held in combat. What made the weapon feared was not the flaw itself. Every weapon has flaws. The Arisaka had flaws. The Mauser had flaws. The Mosin Nagant had flaws. What made the M1 Garand the rifle that Japanese soldiers would learn to fear on islands thousands of miles from Springfield was the institutional willingness to admit the flaw existed. The decision to recall 48,119 units before the war began. The choice to stop a production line when stopping it was the most dangerous thing an army could do. The signature on a piece of paper in a quiet Washington office that said, in language no bureaucracy ever wants to write, we built the wrong version. If Drury had not written those letters in 1939, if the Ordnance Committee had not signed off in October, if Springfield had kept building gas traps through 1941 and shipped them to the men who would carry them at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan, if the United States Army had treated its mistake the way every other major army on Earth treated theirs, buried, denied, shipped, then the weapon that a North Dakota guardsman carried into a flooded foxhole on the night of October 25th, 1942 would have been a different rifle. Carbon fouled, bayonet wobbling, the occasional gas cylinder blowing off the muzzle in the middle of a firefight. And the banzai charge that hit his line that night would have looked very different against it. But there was a problem the Army had not anticipated. The weapon it had recalled and corrected and quietly perfected in the years before the war still had to reach the men who needed it most, and the service branch that would fight the majority of the island war in the Pacific, the one that would face the banzai charge at its most desperate and its most determined, had been told officially and publicly that the M1 Garand could not be trusted. The United States Marine Corps did not want the rifle. In November of 1940, the Marine Corps ran its own evaluation of the M1 Garand. The test was conducted alongside 3 other semi-automatic designs, the Pedersen, the Johnson, and a Winchester prototype. The Marine Board included some of the most experienced small arms men in the American military, officers who had carried rifles in jungles and who understood what salt water and coral sand did to a weapon's internals. Their conclusion was careful. Under favorable conditions, the M1 was superior to the Springfield. Under severe conditions and amphibious operations were considered severe, the board was not ready to put it in the hands of Marines wading through surf and crawling across reef. The mud test was the one that made the newspapers. The Springfield, caked in like-consistency mud, could still be operated. The bolt was stiff, but it moved. A man could force it. The M1, dusted in the same mud, would not function. And the longer a soldier tried to work the action by hand, the harder it became. The mud packed tighter with every attempt. Time magazine published the results in March of 1941 under the headline Army Report on the Garand. The Marine findings were described as a grave indictment of the rifle's dependability. That was the public record. That was the story every Marine officer read. And that was the institutional memory that every man in the 1st Marine Division carried with him when he climbed into a transport ship bound for a place called Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942. The Marine Corps would go to war in the Pacific, carrying the M1903 Springfield, the same bolt-action rifle their fathers had carried in the trenches of France in 1918, but 7,000 miles to the west. On a chain of islands the American public could barely find on a map, the M1 Garand was about to fight its first battle, not on Guadalcanal. Earlier, in a defeat so total that the weapon's performance there would be almost completely forgotten. The Philippines fell fast. On December 8th, 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces began their invasion. The American and Filipino defenders were pushed back, consolidated on the Bataan Peninsula, and held out for 5 months under conditions that worsened by the week. Food ran short. Ammunition ran short. Malaria did not run short. The garrison was armed with a mix of weapons: M1903 Springfields, M1917 Enfields, Browning automatic rifles, and in smaller numbers, scattered through certain units of the Philippine Department, the new M1 Garand. It was there, on Bataan, in the early months of 1942, during a campaign the United States was losing, that the M1 first proved what it could do. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Fry, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 57th Infantry Regiment, Philippine Scouts, described the effect of the M1 in terms that read like a man trying to explain something he had not expected to see. The firepower of a battalion armed with modern weapons, Fry reported, was beyond his descriptive powers. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the defense from Corregidor, sent a cable to Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall in February of 1942. The message was direct. Garand rifles were giving superior service to the Springfield. No mechanical defects were reported. No stoppages from dust or dirt in foxhole use. The weapon had been in almost constant action for as much as a week, without cleaning or lubrication. This was the rifle the Marine Corps had called unreliable. MacArthur, fighting a losing war on the other side of the Pacific, was reporting that it worked better than the Springfield in exactly the kind of conditions the Marines had warned against. And then Bataan fell. On April 9th, 1942, Major General Edward P. King surrendered the Bataan Peninsula. Roughly 76,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their arms. What followed was the Bataan Death March, 66 miles of forced movement from Mariveles to San Fernando, under conditions so brutal that thousands of prisoners died on the road from exhaustion, disease, and execution. A month later, on May 6th, the last defenders on Corregidor surrendered. The Philippines were gone. Among the wreckage, in the tunnels and storage areas, and abandoned fighting positions, Japanese soldiers collected thousands of captured American weapons: Springfields, Enfields, carbines, pistols, But the weapons that drew the most attention were the M1 Garands. Some had clearly been through months of hard use. They carried dust, mud, worn slings, and the marks of long service in brutal conditions. Japanese naval ordnance officers. These rifles were more than battlefield souvenirs. They were technical evidence. Captured M1s were crated and shipped from Manila back to Japan. They were delivered to Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on the shore of Tokyo Bay, where engineers began to study them. They disassembled the rifles. They measured every component. They tested the gas system. They examined the rotating bolt. They understood, at a technical level, exactly what they were looking at. A semi-automatic infantry rifle that could put 8 aimed rounds down range in. It took a man with an Arisaka to fire 3, and then nothing happened. The engineers at Yokosuka filed their reports. The captured rifles were catalogued, and the information that should have changed the way the Imperial Japanese Army planned every infantry engagement for the rest of the war did not reach the men who needed it. Japanese field manuals were not updated. Unit briefings were not revised. When the 17th Army began planning its assault on Henderson Field in October of 1942, 5 months after Bataan fell, 5 months after captured Garands had been shipped to Tokyo, the operational assumption remained unchanged. American infantry carried bolt-action M1903 Springfield.
5 rounds per magazine, 15 aimed shots per minute.
This was not a failure of intelligence collection. The Japanese had the rifle. They had studied it. They understood its capability. This was a failure of institutional communication. The evidence existed. It sat in a naval arsenal 60 miles from Imperial General Headquarters, and nobody ensured it reached the officers writing the tactical plans for Guadalcanal. Consider the contrast. In 1939, the United States Army identified a flaw in the M1 and communicated it through the chain of command within months. Letters were written, tests were conducted, a formal recommendation was signed, production was halted, 48,000 rifles were recalled. The corrected version was in the hands of combat troops before the first shot of the war was fired. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army captured physical proof that the American infantry rifle had fundamentally changed, and the information never left the arsenal. 2 institutions, 2 ways of handling critical information. The consequences of the difference would arrive in 5 months, on a rainy night in the Solomon Islands. The 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7th, 1942. They came ashore almost unopposed, walked across a beach, littered with abandoned Japanese construction equipment, and captured a half-built airfield that Japanese engineers had been carving out of the jungle for weeks. The Marines named it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. Then they watched their own Navy sail away. The transports left before all the supplies were ashore. The Marines were stranded on a jungle island with incomplete rations, incomplete ammunition stocks, and a perimeter they did not have enough men to hold properly. For the next 10 weeks, they ate captured Japanese rice. They fought malaria. They buried friends. And they did all of it carrying the M1903 Springfield, the rifle they had been told was the right weapon for the job. On October 13th, 1942, 67 days after the Marines had landed, a convoy appeared off Lunga Point. Landing craft ground onto the beach and dropped their ramps, and men from a world the Marines had almost forgotten began wading ashore. They were not Marines. They were soldiers, National Guardsmen, farm boys and store clerks, and weekend warriors from North Dakota, members of the 164th Infantry Regiment, American Division. Most of them had never heard a shot fired in combat. They carried wooden crates up the beach, and inside those crates, packed in cosmoline, were brand new M1 Garand rifles. Everyone had the redesigned gasport front end. The Marines watching from the tree line had been living in the jungle for more than 2 months. They had fought the Battle of the Tenaroo. They had held Edson's Ridge. They had lost weight, lost friends, and lost whatever illusions about war. They had carried off the transport ships in August, and they had done all of it with bolt-action Springfields. When the first Marine saw what came out of those crates, his reaction was not gratitude, it was closer to envy. What followed is one of the better documented small scandals of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Marines who had been told the M1 was unreliable began testing it the way men in combat test any new piece of equipment, cautiously at first. Then, with growing confidence, Marines who had access to Garands took them into heavy jungle. They fired them in mud. They fired them in rain. They fired them in the kind of conditions the Marine Board back in the States had specifically warned against. The action did not jam any more often than the Springfield. The 3 extra rounds, 8 instead of 5, produced something that John B. George, an Army officer and national-level rifle competitor who served on Guadalcanal with the 132nd Infantry Regiment of the same American Division, would later describe as a certain assurance and confidence. The reduced recoil of the semi-automatic action made shooters who had been timid with the heavy hick of the bolt action 36 more willing to fire. More willing to fire meant more accurate. More accurate meant more lethal. The demand began almost immediately. Soldiers of the 164th Infantry said later that if they set their Garand down and turned their back for a moment, a Marine arm would reach out of the jungle and the rifle would disappear. The thefts were not isolated incidents. They became systematic. Marines were pilfering Garands from Army soldiers with the same resourcefulness they applied to Japanese supply dumps. When the 1st Marine Division departed Guadalcanal in December of 1942, Army officers had to be stationed at the embarkation points. Their job was simple: confiscate every M1 Garand carried aboard ship by a Marine. The Corps had officially rejected the weapon. Its men were stealing it at every opportunity. The institution had said no. The men who carried rifles into combat had said something else entirely. 10 days after the 164th Infantry came ashore, the rifle was tested in conditions no proving ground could replicate. The Battle of Henderson Field began on the night of October 23rd, 1942, 2 days of probing attacks. Japanese patrols testing the American perimeter, looking for gaps, mapping the wire. Then on October 24th, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutaki's 17th assault at the southern and eastern sectors of the defensive line. The southern sector was held by Lieutenant Colonel Lewis B. Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller's men carried Springfields. The eastern flank, the ground the Japanese had to cross to reach the airfield, was held by the 164th Infantry Regiment, the North Dakota Guardsmen, the men who had been on the island for 10 days. They carried Garands. What happened on that line over the next 36 hours has been documented in both Army after-action reports and Marine Corps operational records. The accounts are consistent on one point that neither service had reason to exaggerate: the volume of fire the 164th produced, foxhole for foxhole, man for man, was unlike anything the Marines had been able to generate with their Springfields. An infantry squad armed with 8-round Garands put more aimed rounds downrange in any given 30-second window than the same number of men with 5-round bolt-action rifles. The mathematics were not subtle, they were not theoretical, they were audible. The Japanese came in waves, screaming, running, bayonets fixed, officers with swords. They crossed open ground in the darkness, closing on the American line the way their doctrine had taught them, the way it had worked against Chinese conscripts at Shanghai and Nanking, the way it had carried the Imperial Army across half of Asia. The doctrine was built on a specific assumption about the defender's rate of fire. A man with a bolt-action rifle had to fire, work the bolt, reacquire, fire again. The gap between shots was the attacker's window. A mass formation of infantry with bayonets could close that window if they moved fast enough and accepted the losses. At Henderson Field, the window closed on the attackers. The men of the 164th were firing 8 rounds as fast as they could pull the trigger. Reloading took 2 to 3 seconds, then 8 more rounds, then 8 more. The volume of fire pouring out of the American foxholes was so continuous and so heavy that Japanese officers who survived the night reported a conclusion that would appear again and again in captured documents across the Pacific. They believed they had charged into concealed machine gun positions across the entire American front. There were no machine guns in most of those positions. There were Garands, semi-automatic rifles in the hands of men who had been weekend soldiers 3 months earlier, firing with a speed and volume that the Japanese had no framework to understand. Their field manuals said bolt-action Springfields. What they ran into was something their intelligence had failed to warn them existed. By dawn on October 26th, the Japanese ground offensive against Henderson Field was finished. The 17th Army had broken against the line. The Imperial Army never made another major attempt to take the airfield. 2 days later, President Franklin Roosevelt told the New York Herald-Tribune Forum that it appeared the turning point of the war in the Pacific had been reached. He did not mention the M1 Garand. He did not mention Major Drury's letter. He did not mention the 48,119 recalled rifles or the redesigned front end finalized on March 15th, 1940. But the weapon the 164th Infantry had carried into that line, debugged for 3 years before the first Japanese soldier ever heard one fire, was a significant part of why the turning point came when it did. John B. George arrived on Guadalcanal with the 132nd Infantry Regiment, the 2nd Army Unit, to reach the island as part of the American Division. He was an unusual soldier. Before the war, he had been a national-level competitive shooter, the youngest person to win the Illinois State 1,000-yard championship. He understood rifles the way a concert pianist understands a keyboard, not as an abstraction, but as a physical relationship between a man and a piece of precision machinery. After the war, he would serve with Merrill's Marauders in Burma. In 1147, he published a book called Shots Fired in Anger. It remains one of the most carefully observed first-hand accounts of small arms combat from the Pacific Theater, written by a man who treated the comparison between American and Japanese weapons with the rigor of a professional marksman. George's assessment of the M1 was unambiguous. He called it probably the very best rifle in the war and the best military hand weapon ever placed on the battlefield. The 8-round clip gave the American soldier 3 more rounds than the Springfield's 5-round magazine. George did not dress that up in analysis. He wrote simply that 5 shots are not as good as 8. But the passage in his book worth reading most carefully is where he describes a single engagement in close detail. 2 American soldiers facing a Japanese soldier charging with a bayonet. The 2 men pointed their Garands at his chest. Then, in George's own phrasing, they pumped the triggers until both clips were ringingly ejected from the receivers. 16 rounds of 36 at point-blank range in roughly 4 seconds. George's observation about the continued fire was precise. It was not hysteria. It was not waste. The charging soldier was alive and dangerous, in George's judgment, until perhaps the last 2 rounds were fired. 16 rounds in 4 seconds, from 2 rifles, against one man who was still coming forward after the first 14 hit him. The mathematics of stopping a determined infantry charge had changed, and the doctrine that had carried the Imperial Japanese Army from Manchuria to Singapore, the doctrine built on the assumption that bolt-action defenders could be overwhelmed by speed and willingness to die, was about to meet its end. The Banzai charge had a logic. That is the part Western histories have often gotten wrong. From the Japanese perspective, in the context of the wars Japan had fought before 1942, it was not an irrational suicide tactic. It was a calculated exploitation of a specific mathematical weakness in early 20th century infantry combat. Bolt-action rifles fire slowly. A defender armed with one has to time each shot, work the bolt, reacquire the target, and fire again. The interval between shots is the interval the attacker can use. A mass of infantry, armed with bayonets, charging across short distances with absolute commitment, could, in theory, close the gap during that interval and overwhelm the defender in hand-to-hand fighting. It had worked. It had worked against poorly equipped Chinese conscripts at Shanghai, at Nanking, at dozens of smaller engagements across the grinding years of the Sino-Japanese War. Japanese doctrine codified the charge. Japanese officers built careers around its successful execution. Japanese enlisted men were trained to believe that the spirit of the warrior could overcome the mathematics of the rifle. The mathematics changed in August of 1942. On the 17th of that month, Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson's 2nd Marine Raider Battalion landed on Makin Island in the Gilbert Islands. The raiders launched from 2 submarines, USS Nautilus and USS Argonaut, on a diversionary raid timed to draw Japanese attention from the Guadalcanal landings 10 days earlier. Carlson had organized his raider companies around a principle that was unconventional for the Marine Corps. Each squad was divided into 3 fire teams. Each fire team had one man carrying an M1 Garand for accurate semi-automatic fire at range, one man with a Thompson submachine gun for close work, one man with a Browning automatic rifle for suppressive fire. 3 weapons, 3 roles, 1 team. The M1 was the precision instrument at the center of it. The Japanese garrison on Makin, after their machine gun positions were knocked out and upped, did exactly what their training told them to do. They formed up. They fixed, they charged. They were stopped cold by rapid, accurate American fire. They regrouped and charged again. It did not work the second time either. The charge that had broken Chinese lines at Shanghai could not break a Marine line armed with semi-automatic rifles and automatic weapons at Makin. The result was a footnote in 1942. It would become a pattern across the next 3 years. The largest Banzai charge of the entire war came on July 7th, 1944, on an island called Saipan. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito knew the battle was lost. The Americans had driven his forces into the northern corner of the island. The sea was behind him. Reinforcement was impossible. Supply was impossible. Surrender, in the tradition of the Imperial Army, was unthinkable. On the evening of July 6th, Saito gathered what remained of his command, roughly 4,300 men, soldiers, sailors, walking wounded, and some civilians. Many were unarmed. Some carried sharpened bamboo sticks. Some carried nothing at all. Saito ordered every man capable of moving forward to join a final charge at the American lines. The target was the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. New York Guardsmen, holding a line on Tanapag Plain on the island's western coast. At 4:45 in the morning on July 7th, the charge began. An American major on the line compared it to a cattle stampede that would not end. Japanese officers found a gap between the two battalions and poured men into it. The attackers advanced over 1,000 yards. They overran American positions. They pushed so deep into the line that some soldiers of the 105th were cut off entirely, forced to swim to American destroyers offshore to survive. The fighting lasted 15 hours. When it was over, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment had been nearly destroyed. 406 men killed, 512 wounded, 918 casualties out of roughly 1,100 men. The Japanese force was annihilated. The body count in front of the 105th's position was 2,295. Another 2,016 were found dead to the rear of the American line, killed as they tried to push through to the airfield beyond. A total of 4,311 Japanese soldiers died in the charge. 3 members of the 105th Infantry Regiment received the Medal of Honor posthumously for their actions on that single day. Whatever the Banzai charge had been at Shanghai, at Nanking, at Singapore, by July of 1944, against American infantry, armed with the weapon that had been recalled and redesigned 5 years before the war, it was finished as a viable tactic. The mathematics that had made it possible against bolt-action defenders were the same mathematics that made it suicidal against semi-automatic ones. The doctrine had not changed. The weapon it was designed to defeat had. And then, almost immediately after the Garand began to prove itself in the Pacific, a second mistake appeared. Not a real one, an imagined one, born in the same combat, on the same nights, carried by the same men. A mistake that would follow the M1 Garand for the next 80 years through magazines and movies and internet arguments. A mistake the Army never tried to fix, for a reason that says more about institutional intelligence than the fix itself ever could. The M1 Garand fed from an 8-round metal clip called an N block. The clip held the cartridges in 2 staggered rows of 4. It loaded from the top of the open action in a single motion. Press down with the thumb until the bolt slammed forward, and woe to the man who let his thumb linger 1 fraction of a second too long. The bolt would catch it on the way home. M1 thumb. Every man who carried the weapon either learned the lesson once or carried the scar. When the 8th round fired, the bolt locked open and the empty clip was ejected upward out of the receiver. An internal lever struck the clip on the way out, and the clip made a sound. A ping. High, clear, metallic, unmistakable, on a quiet firing range. You have heard it. It is in Saving Private Ryan. It is in the Pacific. It is in Band of Brothers. It is, for a great many Americans, the auditory signature of the entire United States infantry of the Second World War. Somewhere in the Pacific, possibly on Guadalcanal, possibly later, a legend was born about that sound. The story has been told and retold for 80 years. It goes like this. A Guy is in a firefight. He fires his 8 rounds. The empty clip ejects with its ping. A Japanese soldier nearby hears the sound, recognizes that the American rifle is empty, leaps from cover, and kills the helpless American before he can reload. According to the legend, the ping was the M1's fatal weakness, a built-in tell, a sound that announced to any attentive enemy that the man behind the rifle was, for the next 3 seconds, defenseless. The legend has been investigated and re-investigated by firearms historians and by veterans themselves. Jonathan Ferguson at Armament Research Services examined it in detail. The British Channel bloke on the range tested it on camera. In 1952, a technical memorandum designated OROT-18, produced by G. N. Donovan, as part of Project Doughboy at the Johns Hopkins Operations Research Office, interviewed American soldiers fighting in Korea about whether the ping had ever endangered them in combat. The conclusion of every serious study has been the same. The ping, as a tactical advantage to the enemy, was almost entirely a myth. The reasons are not complicated. They do not require a degree in acoustics or a background in infantry tactics. They require only a moment of thought about what a battlefield actually sounds like. A small piece of stamped steel ejecting from a rifle is, in the absence of other sound, audible. On a quiet range on a Sunday morning in Ohio, you can hear it clearly from 20 yards away. In the middle of a firefight with 36 rounds cracking past at 2,800 feet per second, machine guns hammering from fixed positions, mortars dropping in the middle distance, men screaming and shouting, artillery rumbling from behind the ridgeline, the ping is buried under a wall of noise that no human ear can isolate in real time. The question was never whether the enemy might theoretically hear the sound. The question was whether anyone could hear anything that small in the middle of that much chaos. And even if a Japanese soldier somehow distinguished one metallic ping from every other metallic sound on the battlefield, even if he somehow knew that the specific American 20 yards in front of him had just fired his last round, what could he do about it in the next 3 seconds? 3 seconds is how long it took a trained rifleman to slap a fresh clip into the receiver. A Japanese soldier rising from cover at the sound of a ping would be standing upright in plain view, was either already reloading or being covered by the 3 other Americans within 20 feet of him who were not out of ammunition. The documentary evidence is even more conclusive than the logic. There is no capped Japanese training manual instructing soldiers to listen for the ping. There is no post-war interrogation in which a Japanese veteran describes the tactic being used successfully. And the fact that clinches it beyond argument is one already established earlier in this story. The field manuals captured from Japanese units during the Pacific War indicated that American infantry were armed with the M1903 Springfield. The Imperial Japanese Army, as of 1942, had not been told the M1 Garand existed. A Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal was not listening for an M1 ping because his training did not assume Americans had M1s. He was listening for bolt action fire that cycled every 2 seconds. What he heard instead was semi-automatic fire that sounded like a machine gun. The ping, even if it occurred, was lost inside a sound his training had given him no framework to interpret. The 1952 noted something that the 80 years of mythology have consistently ignored. Some soldiers reported that they found the ping useful. It was a signal, an audible reminder that the weapon was empty and it was time to reload. Not a liability, a feature. The noise the clip made a way out told the man holding the rifle exactly what he needed to know without looking down at the receiver. Here is the thing worth pausing on. The first mistake, the gas trap, was a real flaw. The Army documented it, recalled 48,119 rifles, stopped a production line, redesigned the front end, and put the corrected version into the hands of every soldier and Marine who fought in the Pacific. The second mistake, the ping, was not a flaw at all. It was a sound. Soldiers worried about it Veterans told stories about it. Movies dramatized it. Internet forums still argue about it 8 decades later. The Army never tried to fix it. There was no project to redesign the en-bloc clip, no special order to muffle the ejection sound, no engineering study to replace the clip with a box magazine. Army simply lived with it, not because the Army was indifferent, not because it lacked the engineering talent. The institution that had been willing to stop a production line in 1939 to fix something genuinely broken was also willing in 1942 and 1943 and 1944 to leave alone something that was not broken at all. That distinction, the ability to tell the difference between a problem that mattered and a problem that did not, is a kind of institutional discipline that does not appear in the history of any other major army of the Second World War. Other armies confused action with judgment. They fixed things that did not need fixing and ignored things that did, because the institutional reflex was to respond to noise rather than to evidence. The American Ordnance Department made a quieter choice. It asked a question that most bureaucracies never think to ask. Does this problem actually kill soldiers, or does it only worry them? The answer, in the case of the Ping, was that it worried them, and the Ordnance Department had the discipline to let a worry stand while it focused its resources on problems that were real. The 8 rounds that came before the Ping did the work that mattered. The causal chain that began in a quiet Washington office in March of 1939 closed on a beach in the Mariana Islands in July of 1944. The gas trap did not make the M1 Garand feared in the Pacific. The gas trap, as a piece of hardware, was a footnote. Almost nobody outside Springfield Armory ever fired one in combat. The flaw itself did nothing for the weapon. No weapon in the history of warfare has ever been perfect. What matters is not whether a flaw exists. What matters is what the institution holding the weapon does about it. What made the M1 Garand, the rifle that Japanese soldiers learned to dread on islands they had expected to hold, was not the engineering. It was the paper trail. A letter typed by Major Guy Drury on March 8, 1939. A follow-up to Captain Sydenham on June 10th. 10 test rifles shipped to Fort Benning on September 27th. A formal recommendation signed by the Ordnance Committee on October 26th, 53 days after the invasion of Poland. A production halt. A recall of 48,119 rifles. A redesigned front end finalized on March 15th, 1940. Delivery of corrected components beginning in June. The last gas trap rolling off the line in August. Each step was small. Each step was bureaucratic. Each step was the kind of work that smells of carbon, paper, and tastes of cold coffee, and never appears in any movie about any war. And each step was a link in a chain that connected a drawing board in Springfield, Massachusetts, to a foxhole in the Alaf Islands on a rainy night in October of 1942, and to 1,000 other foxholes like it, on islands whose names most Americans had never heard spoken aloud: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The acknowledgement was the cause, the reliable weapon. In the hands of the 164th Infantry at Henderson Field was the effect. No other major army in the Second World War made that kind of correction to its frontline service rifle during peacetime. The United States Army did, and the consequences played out in the foxholes of the Pacific from October of 1942 to August of 1945. On January 26th, 1945, with the Battle of the Bulge winding down and the Third Army driving east into the collapsing Reich, Lieutenant General George S. Patton sat down and wrote a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell, the Chief of Ordnance. The letter is preserved in the National Archives. Patton was not a man given to flattery. He did not waste words on equipment he considered adequate. He did not praise things that merely worked. The opening sentence of that letter has become one of the most quoted endorsements in American military history. In my opinion, Patton wrote, "The M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." He did not say greatest rifle. He said greatest battle implement. The word choice mattered. Patton was not evaluating a target shooting instrument. He was evaluating a tool for killing men in combat. And he was saying that in the entire history of human warfare, from the spear to the machine gun, nothing had done that job better than the weapon John Garand had designed. It is worth noting what Patton did not say. He did not credit Major Drury. He did not mention the gas trap recall. He did not reference the redesigned front end or the 10,000-round endurance test or the production halt of 1940. Patton saw the result. He had no reason to trace the chain of decisions behind it. Generals rarely do. The praise was earned. But it was earned by men whose names Patton never knew, working in offices he never visited, making decisions that never required courage under fire, but required something almost as rare in a large institution: the willingness to write down that the thing you built was wrong. The Marines who had been warned in 1941 that the M1 Garand was a fair-weather weapon ended the war as some of its most devoted users. After Guadalcanal, the institutional resistance collapsed. The Corps had watched its own men steal the rifle from Army soldiers. It had received the reports from the field. It had read MacArthur's cable from Bataan. The weapon the Marine Board had tested in mud and declared untrustworthy had been tested in combat and declared indispensable. Tarawa onward, the Marines fought with Garands. Tarawa, November 1943. The 2nd Marine Division waded across a reef under murderous fire to reach a fortified island the Japanese had been preparing for over a year. The landing was one of the bloodiest of the war. The Marines who made it to shore fought in waist-deep water, in coral sand, in salt spray that coated every weapon they carried. Combat reports from Tarawa noted that even in the exact amphibious conditions the Marine Board had warned about, the M1's action cleared with standard remedial steps: tap, rack, fire. The rifle the board had rejected in a mud test functioned in a battle that was worse than any test could simulate. Saipan, June and July 944. Marines and soldiers carried the M1 through sugar-cane fields, over volcanic ridges, into cave systems the Japanese had spent months fortifying. The rifle performed. Peleliu, September 1944. One of the most savage battles of the Pacific. The 1st Marine Division, the same unit that had landed on Guadalcanal with Springfields and watched the 164th come ashore with Garands, fought for over 2 months in temperatures that exceeded 115 degrees. They carried Garands, every man. Iwo Jima, February 1945. Okinawa, April 1945. The old, who had breed in since the new breed, Katyn since the beginning, and the replacements who had arrived in the fine quack year, all of them carrying the same weapon, the one that had been recalled and corrected and quietly perfected before any of them had heard of any of those islands. The arc was complete. The Marine Corps had gone from official rejection to systematic theft to total dependence in the space of 3 years. The institution that said no became the institution that could not fight without it. But the story of the M1 Garand does not end at the American perimeter. It ends across the line, in the arsenals of the enemy that tried and failed to answer it. In 1944, 2 years after Japanese naval ordnance engineers had studied, captured M1 Garands at Yokosuka, the Imperial Japanese Navy authorized a program to build a copy. Not the Army, the Navy. The Imperial Japanese Army had experimented with semi-automatic rifle designs in the 1930s. Several prototypes had been built and tested. Every program had been abandoned. By the time the captured Garands arrived from Bataan, the Army was fully committed to the Arisaka bolt action platform and had no institutional appetite for starting over. The generals who had built their careers on bayonet charges and spiritual superiority were not inclined to admit that the enemy's rifle had made their doctrine obsolete. The Navy saw it differently. The Imperial Japanese Navy had its own weapons development infrastructure, its own arsenals, its own engineering talent. And unlike the Army, the Navy had watched its island garrisons get annihilated by American infantry, whose rate of fire the defenders could not match and could not explain. The program was assigned to Yokosuka Naval Arsenal on the shore of Tokyo Bay. The rifle was designated the Type 4. Engineers at Yokosuka copied the Garands gas system and rotating bolt, rechambered the design for the standard Japanese 7 by 58 mm Arisaka cartridge, and replaced the American on-block clip with a 10-round internal magazine fed by 2 standard 5-round stripper clips. The modifications were practical. The stripper clips were already in the Japanese supply chain. The tangent sights matched Japanese infantry training. The bayonet mount accepted the Type 99 sword bayonet. On paper, the Type 4 was a weapon that could be manufactured using existing Japanese components and issued to troops already familiar with the manual of arms for Arisaka pattern rifles. On paper, in practice, the program was given to Yokosuka as a spare-time project. The arsenal's primary mission was producing 25 mm anti-aircraft cannons, Lewis machine guns, and Vickers machine guns. Demand for those weapons was overwhelming. American bombers were hitting Japanese cities. American submarines were sinking Japanese transports. The war economy was collapsing. Every hour of machine time and every pound of steel had to be justified against competing demands that were more urgent and more immediate than a semi-automatic rifle that might enter service at some point in the future. The Type 4 was built on the 3rd floor of the machine gun plant, in the gaps between shifts, using materials that could be spared from higher priority production, by engineers who were simultaneously trying to keep the anti-aircraft guns coming off the line fast enough to shoot down B-29s. 20 prototypes were completed. Testing revealed problems with the feed system. An improved version, sometimes referred to as the Type 5, was developed in early 1945 to address the issues. By the time the war ended in August, approximately 125 complete rifles had been assembled at Yokosuka. Parts for perhaps 200 existed in various stages of completion. Not one Type 4 was issued to a combat unit. Not one was fired at an American soldier. The rifle that was supposed to answer the M1 Garand sat in an arsenal 60 miles from Tokyo while the empire that built it burned. When Allied occupation forces entered Yokosuka Naval Arsenal after the surrender, they found the Type 4 rifles. They catalogued them. They photographed them. They shipped samples back to Aberdeen Proving Ground for evaluation. The rifles exist today in museum collections and in the hands of a very small number of private collectors who understand what they represent. They represent the clearest possible admission that the M1 Garand was feared. An enemy does not copy a weapon it considers ordinary. An enemy does not reverse engineer a rifle, rechamber it for its own ammunition, redesign the feed system, and assign an arsenal to produce it. Unless that weapon has created a problem, the enemy cannot solve any other way. The Type 4 program was Japan's institutional acknowledgement that the semi-automatic rifle had changed infantry combat, and that the Arisaka could not compete. The acknowledgement came too late. The industrial capacity to act on it was gone. Consider the symmetry. In 9939, the United States Army identified a flaw in the M1 Garand and spent 3 years before the war correcting it. The corrected rifle reached the Pacific in time for Guadalcanal. In 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy identified the M1 Garand as a threat and spent 3 years during the war trying to copy it. The copy never reached the battlefield. 2 institutions, 2 timelines, 3 years each. One produced a weapon that changed the war. The other produced 125 rifles that changed nothing. The difference was not engineering talent. Japanese ordnance engineers were highly capable. The difference was not raw materials, though by 1944, those were desperately scarce. The difference was timing. The Americans fixed their weapon before the war started. The Japanese tried to answer it after the war was already lost. John Cantius Garand never made $1 in royalties from the rifle that bears his name. Not $1, not a cent, not from the first rifle produced in 1937, not from the 4 millionth, not from any of the roughly 5.5 million M1 Garands manufactured before production ended. As a civilian employee of Springfield Armory, a federal installation, Garands patents were assigned to the United States government. That was the deal. Civil service salary in exchange for whatever he designed on government time, using government tools in a government workshop. The arrangement was standard. It was legal. And it meant that the man who solved the problem that defeated every major arms designer in Europe received the same compensation he would have received if the rifle had never worked at all. A bill was introduced in Congress during the 1940s to award Garand a one-time payment of $100,000. The reasoning was straightforward. The man had designed the most important infantry weapon of the war. His design was saving American lives across 2 theaters of combat. The government had paid him a civil service wage. $100,000 was not wealth. It was recognition. The bill did not pass. John Garand continued to work at Springfield Armory. He continued to refine and improve the M1 design. He continued to walk through those gates every morning, the way he had since 1919. On his last day, in 1953, the Armory presented him with the 1 millionth M1 Garand produced. A ceremony, a handshake, a rifle with a serial number that meant something to the institution, if not to the accountants who had decided his contribution was not worth $100,000. He retired to Springfield, Massachusetts. He lived quietly. He did not give interviews. He did not write a memoir. He did not appear on television to complain about the bill that failed. The man who had quit school at 12 and taught himself to shoot with borrowed rifles and taught himself engineering through correspondence courses and designed a weapon that armed the infantry of the most powerful military on earth simply stopped going to work and went home. He died on February 16th, 1974. He was 86 years old. His rifles are still being fired. Every year at Camp Perry, Ohio, competitive shooters enter the John C. Garand match and put 8 rounds of .36 through actions designed by a French-Canadian immigrant who swept floors in a Connecticut textile mill. The ping rings out across the firing line the way it has for 80 years. Nobody flinches. Nobody charges. The sound that was supposed to be the rifle's fatal flaw is the sound of a tradition that refuses to end. Men like Major Drury, who signed his letters in a Washington office and never saw a Japanese soldier in his life, do not appear in the movies about the Pacific. Their work was small, procedural, invisible, done at desks that smelled of carbon paper and pipe tobacco, in buildings where the loudest sound was a typewriter carriage returning. They did not storm beaches. They did not hold perimeters. They did not fix bayonets in the dark, while 3,000 men ran screaming toward their foxholes. But if you want to understand why, a Marine in a flooded hole on Edson's Ridge could put 8 rounds of 36 into 3 targets in the time a Japanese rifleman chambered 2. The answer does not start on Guadalcanal. It starts with a letter typed in Washington on March 8th, 1939. It starts with a signature on a recommendation dated October 26th. It starts with a production line that went quiet in the spring of 1940 while the rest of the world was gearing up for war. The second mistake, the ping, survives in folklore precisely because the first mistake was solved so completely. An army that fixes its real problems can afford to carry around imaginary ones. The ping killed nobody who would not have been killed anyway. It frightened soldiers. It frightened audiences in movie theaters. It still frightens people in YouTube comment sections who have never held a rifle and never will. But the weapon behind the ping was the one that had been engineered, recalled, retooled, and rebuilt in the years before the war began. The 8 rounds before the sound did the work that mattered. The men who carried the M1 Garand into the worst the Imperial Japanese Army could throw at them had names. The young soldier dragging a crate up the beach at Lunga Point, John George from Illinois. The marksman who wrote down what he saw with the precision of a man who understood that the difference between 5 rounds and 8 was the difference between a dead American and a living one. John Basilone from New Jersey, the Marine who held a machine gun position on Guadalcanal and died on Iwo Jima, carrying the same faith in American firepower that the M1 had helped create. The men of the 164th Infantry, weekend soldiers from North Dakota, who had never heard a shot fired in anger until they walked into the most desperate night of the Guadalcanal campaign and held a line the Japanese could not break. The men of the 105th Infantry, New York Guardsmen who stood on Tanapag Plain at Saipan while 4,300 Japanese soldiers charged at them for 15 hours and did not stop fighting until 918 of their own were casualties and 4,311 of the enemy were dead. The rifle did not win the Pacific. They did. The weapon was what the United States Army managed to put in their hands. A rifle designed by a man who never finished high school, built in a factory that employed women for 43% of its workforce, recalled when it was wrong, corrected before the war, and carried into combat by men whose names fill rosters that nobody reads anymore, but that somebody should. The willingness to admit a mistake before the shooting starts is rarer than the metal in 8 rounds of 36, and it deserves to be remembered the way the men who carried the rifle deserve to be remembered, by name.